The weapon runs true, then dies, and in that instant men realize they are no longer hunters but exposed targets in hostile water. They were promised certainty, a clean strike, a single moment where faith in the mission would be rewarded. Yet the moment arrives and nothing happens. Not the explosion they trusted, not the ending they were sold, only silence that feels like betrayal. Hope drains faster than air as the crew waits for a result that refuses to exist, and the confidence drilled into them turns into a sick awareness that something essential has lied. Eyes meet in the dark with a question no one dares to voice, because the pause feels familiar, as if this failure was not a surprise at all, but an expectation quietly carried into the mission. The silence stretches, heavy and deliberate, hinting that someone, somewhere, had already seen this outcome and allowed it anyway. When a nation sends men forward with a promise it suspects may not hold, who bears the weight when that promise collapses at the moment lives depend on it? The submarine glides into position with a patience learned through weeks of tension. The crew pressed into silence as the enemy ship fills the periscope view, close enough that its shadow seems to bruise the water itself, and in that compressed moment everything narrows to routine and trust as the order is given and the torpedo leaves the tube exactly as it has been practiced 100 times before. There is no drama in the launch, only discipline, the quiet confidence that this single action will decide whether they live submerged in safety or die hunted in open water. And for several seconds the crew counts in their heads, feeling the weapon run outward, imagining the impact that should already be forming. Instead, time stretches into something unnatural as the expected shock never arrives. No violent confirmation, no sudden lift of the hull, only the unbearable continuation of the enemy ship still moving, still alive, still unaware or perhaps already turning. The captain waits a breath longer than comfort allows, hoping against instinct that the strike is simply delayed, but the ocean remains unchanged, mocking the certainty that filled the control room moments earlier. The realization does not arrive as a shout or an alarm, but as a quiet shift in posture, shoulders tightening, eyes flicking back to the periscope, because the impossible has happened in the most dangerous way imaginable. The enemy vessel begins to react, its course altering just enough to suggest suspicion, and now the crew understands that their moment of invisibility is bleeding away, while the weapon that was supposed to end this encounter has instead exposed them to it. Another torpedo is prepared with hands that move faster than thought, but confidence has already been cracked, replaced by a question no drill ever answered: what if this one fails too? The second launch feels heavier, burdened by doubt, and again the seconds crawl past without the release they are desperate for, until the enemy ship is no longer a passive target but an active threat, turning hard, scanning, alive in a way it should not be. Sound becomes the enemy as the submarine slips deeper, the crew straining to hear what the water will tell them next, and then the first depth charges begin to fall, distant at first, then closer, each explosion confirming the cost of that initial failure. The boat shudders as pressure waves roll across its hull, lights flicker, and the men brace themselves against bulkheads that suddenly feel thinner than faith itself, all while the question pounds louder than the explosions. How could the strike have missed when everything was right? Orders come clipped now, urgency replacing confidence as evasive maneuvers are executed with precision born of fear, and the submarine descends into layers of water meant to hide it, even as the crew senses that concealment is no longer guaranteed. Each explosion above feels personal, a response not just to their presence but to their vulnerability, because had the torpedo done what it was meant to do, none of this would be happening. Minutes stretch into an eternity measured by the creak of the hull and the shallow breaths of men trained not to panic but suddenly forced to confront the idea that their greatest danger did not come from the enemy, but from the weapon they trusted most. The captain replays the approach in his mind, the angle, the distance, the moment of release, searching for a mistake he can claim, something human he can own. Yet every review ends the same way, with a sick understanding that nothing obvious went wrong except the one thing that was never supposed to fail. As the depth charges continue, the crew realizes that survival now depends not on striking back but on enduring punishment meant for a submarine that should already be gone, and that knowledge settles heavily, changing the meaning of every order and every second they remain alive. When the explosions finally begin to drift farther away, and the enemy ship moves on, believing it has either destroyed its prey or driven it off, relief does not arrive with celebration but with exhaustion, because escape does not erase what just happened. In the quiet that follows, as systems are checked and whispered confirmations pass through the boat, the crew is left with an unsettling truth that no victory can cover. They did everything asked of them, and the failure came anyway. The submarine survived the encounter, but something far more dangerous has been damaged beneath the surface. The unspoken contract between the men and the weapons meant to protect them, and as they slip back into the darkness to continue a mission that suddenly feels less certain, the moment of that silent non-explosion lingers, marking the exact instant when trust broke and nothing afterward could be the same. The weapon they carried into the sea was supposed to be the equalizer, the unseen force that allowed a small crew and a fragile hull to challenge larger, more powerful ships and win through precision rather than numbers. Every patrol began with the same quiet assurance that this device was reliable, tested, and ready, a promise reinforced through training and repetition until doubt had no place to settle. Men were taught to believe that once released, it would travel faithfully, find its mark, and end the encounter before the enemy could respond, turning stealth into survival and courage into victory. This belief shaped everything from tactics to morale, because the entire concept of underwater attack rested on the idea that a single well-placed strike could rewrite the balance of power in seconds. When commanders planned approaches and calculated risk, they did so with the expectation that the moment of release would also be the moment of decision, a clean transition from danger to dominance that justified every mile traveled and every hour submerged. Against that expectation, the recent failure feels not just alarming but almost unreal, because nothing in the official story prepared them for a weapon that could run perfectly and still refuse to finish its task. The contrast is jarring. A system presented as dependable meets reality and simply does not perform, leaving crews exposed in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. Training had taught them how to aim, when to fire, and how to escape afterward, but it had never prepared them for the idea that success itself might be denied without warning. The Navy's confidence in this weapon was not casual or implied. It was explicit, woven into doctrine and reinforced by authority, creating an atmosphere where questioning its effectiveness felt unnecessary, even disloyal. Officers spoke of it as a decisive answer to enemy superiority, a tool that allowed American submarines to strike boldly and withdraw safely, and that confidence filtered downward until it became an assumption shared by every man aboard. In that framework, failure was meant to be human, a misjudged distance, a poor angle, a moment of bad luck, not a silent refusal by the weapon itself. The incident at sea shatters that framework, because it reveals a gap between promise and performance that no amount of bravery can close. The weapon did exactly what it was expected to do up to the final moment, moving through the water as designed, reaching the point where triumph should have been inevitable, and then leaving nothing behind but uncertainty. This is what makes the failure so destabilizing, because it undermines not just a mission but the mental structure that allowed crews to operate under constant threat. If the weapon cannot be trusted to deliver at the decisive moment, then every assumption built around it becomes fragile, and every future engagement carries a shadow of doubt that no order can erase. The Navy's expectation was simple and absolute, that when the moment came, the torpedo would answer. The reality now unfolding suggests that expectation was misplaced, and the contrast forces an uncomfortable reevaluation of what men were sent into combat believing. They had accepted danger from the enemy as a given, but they had not consented to uncertainty from their own side, and the difference between those two risks is profound. This gap between what was promised and what occurred creates a tension that cannot be resolved through optimism or discipline alone, because it strikes at the heart of trust, the invisible currency of warfare. As crews continue their patrols, they do so carrying this contradiction with them, still expected to act as if nothing has changed while privately aware that something fundamental has. The official expectation remains intact on paper, but at sea it has been quietly contradicted by experience, and that contradiction grows heavier with every patrol that begins with confidence and ends with questions. The weapon was supposed to simplify combat, to reduce chaos into a single decisive moment, yet its failure has done the opposite, introducing a layer of doubt that complicates every decision. This is the dangerous space the Navy now occupies, a space between belief and reality where doctrine insists on reliability, while lived experience suggests otherwise. The question is no longer whether the weapon should have worked, because by every expectation it should have, but how long men can be asked to act on a promise that the ocean has already begun to dispute. What happened in that first encounter refuses to stay isolated, because as patrols continue and stories circulate in low voices, the same uneasy details begin to surface again and again. Different boats, different crews, yet the same hollow moment where success simply never arrives. Another submarine lines up a perfect approach, releases its weapon, and waits for confirmation that never comes, watching the enemy ship continue on as if untouched, forcing the crew to retreat under pressure instead of rising in triumph. In a separate engagement, a commander risks his boat by closing the distance further than doctrine recommends, convinced that proximity will guarantee the outcome, only to discover that even at near certainty the result is the same silence, followed by frantic evasive action as the enemy responds. These are not reckless men repeating mistakes. They are disciplined crews executing plans that should work, and the repetition of failure begins to feel deliberate in its cruelty. Each incident mirrors the last closely enough to erase the comfort of coincidence, replacing it with a pattern that suggests something far deeper is wrong. The same expectations are carried into each mission, and each time they are met with the same betrayal, reinforcing the sense that the weapon's unreliability is not an exception but a condition. Word spreads not through official channels but through shared glances and cautious conversations, a quiet network of experience that contradicts the confidence projected from above. The pattern grows harder to ignore as more encounters end the same way, with submarines escaping by endurance rather than success, and with crews returning to port haunted by the knowledge that they did everything right and still failed. What makes this repetition so damaging is not just the loss of opportunity, but the erosion of belief, because each new failure confirms the last and strips away another layer of trust. Commanders begin to adjust informally, firing multiple weapons where one should suffice, closing distances that increase danger, and lingering longer than safety allows, all in an attempt to compensate for something they are not supposed to doubt. These adaptations are acts of survival, but they also signal an unspoken admission that the system cannot be relied upon as intended. The failures link together into a chain, each one reinforcing the next, creating a body of experience that stand in direct opposition to official assurances. No single incident triggers alarm on its own, but together they form a narrative that cannot be dismissed as bad luck, because luck does not repeat itself with such precision. The pattern becomes the story, a quiet, accumulating weight that presses on every patrol and every decision, even as it remains officially unacknowledged. Crews begin to wonder whether their experiences are being heard or simply absorbed into silence, and that uncertainty deepens the sense of isolation felt at sea. The repetition strips away the illusion that this is a temporary problem, replacing it with the realization that the failure is systemic, embedded, and ongoing. Each mission that ends without a detonation adds another layer to the pattern, making it harder to deny and more dangerous to ignore. By the time these incidents are viewed together, the question is no longer whether something is wrong, but how many times it must happen before the pattern is acknowledged for what it is. The ocean keeps offering the same lesson, and each time it is paid for with risk, fear, and the narrowing margin between survival and catastrophe. Long before the pattern became impossible to dismiss at sea, unease had already surfaced in quieter places, in controlled settings where doubt could be noted without the sound of explosions to drown it out. There were tests that did not end as cleanly as expected, moments where results raised eyebrows rather than confidence, and small discrepancies that suggested the weapon's behavior was not as predictable as it appeared on paper. These concerns did not erupt into open crisis. They arrived as cautious observations, restrained language, and measured reports that hinted something was off without declaring it broken. Letters moved upward through channels, carrying respectful questions and careful phrasing, suggesting further evaluation, more trials, more attention before lives depended on certainty. Some warnings came from men who trusted the system enough to want it improved, not discredited, and their tone reflected loyalty rather than rebellion. Yet these signals encountered resistance not in the form of outright denial, but through delay, reassignment, and quiet dismissal, as if time itself might smooth out the problem without confronting it directly. Confidence remained the public posture, reinforced by authority and routine, while doubt was treated as an inconvenience that threatened momentum. Testing continued, but often under conditions that reassured rather than challenged assumptions, producing results that could be interpreted favorably and filed away as confirmation. The gap between concern and action widened not because no one noticed it, but because acknowledging it fully would have required admitting uncertainty at a moment when certainty was demanded. As the war intensified, the pressure to move forward outweighed the impulse to pause, and unresolved questions were carried into combat alongside the weapons themselves. Warnings did not vanish. They were absorbed, diluted, and rendered harmless by process, their urgency softened by layers of review and the belief that problems would reveal themselves clearly if they were truly serious. When failures began to occur at sea, they did not arrive as a revelation but as a grim confirmation of what had already been whispered, and even then the response was cautious, framed as isolated anomalies rather than evidence of a deeper flaw. Reports from the field echoed earlier doubts, yet they met the same inertia, caught between competing priorities and the fear of disruption. No single individual needs to be cast as a villain to understand what happened, because the pattern reflects an institutional choice to preserve confidence over confrontation. Each ignored warning represents a moment when action could have been taken without the immediate pressure of lives at stake, and each delay allowed uncertainty to harden into consequence. By the time the failures were undeniable, they were no longer theoretical problems but lived experiences paid for in danger and near disaster. The most unsettling aspect is not that warnings existed, but that they were known, weighed, and set aside, leaving crews to discover the truth in the most unforgiving environment possible. Behind every failed strike and every quiet report lies the reality of men trapped in steel hulls, carrying the weight of decisions made far from the waterline. Crews went to sea believing in a system that would protect them at the decisive moment, and when that protection failed, the cost was measured not only in danger, but in the slow accumulation of fear that no training could fully contain. Inside a submarine under attack, time stretches cruelly as depth charges fall, each explosion reminding the men below that they are alive only because the enemy has not yet finished the job. Faces tighten in the dim light as sailors grip their stations, knowing that had the weapon done its duty, they would already be turning away in safety instead of bracing for impact. Sleep becomes shallow and restless on patrols marked by uncertainty, because the mind replays the moment of failure again and again, searching for reassurance that does not come. Some crews return with their boats scarred and systems damaged, evidence of close calls that never appear in celebratory accounts, while others do not return at all, their absence explained quietly, without dwelling on the role unreliable weapons may have played. The human cost reveals itself in small, personal ways, the tension in a captain's voice as he gives orders he no longer fully trusts, the unspoken agreement among sailors to stay ready for the worst because hope feels dangerous, the letters home that avoid detail while carrying the weight of fear between the lines. Every patrol becomes a gamble where courage is demanded without the guarantee of effectiveness, and that imbalance takes its toll. Men are asked to risk everything with tools that may or may not respond, and the psychological burden of that uncertainty presses as hard as the ocean itself. Loss is not always immediate or visible. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, as the erosion of confidence, as the quiet acceptance that survival may depend more on endurance than success. When submarines fail to return, the connection between their fate and earlier failures lingers, unspoken but heavy, because those who remain understand how narrow the margin truly was. These are not abstract consequences or distant figures. They are lived moments of fear, restraint, and sacrifice, endured by individuals who carried out their duties with discipline even as the foundation beneath them shifted. The human cost is paid in silence as much as in loss, borne by men who trusted that their lives would not be compromised by avoidable uncertainty, and who discovered too late that trust alone could not keep them safe. When the patrols end and the boats slip back into port, the story does not conclude with answers, because no clear reckoning follows the failures that unfolded beneath the waves. The official narrative remains carefully intact, confident language continuing to mask the doubt that has already taken root among those who experience the truth firsthand. What lingers instead is an uneasy silence, the kind that forms when acknowledging a problem would force an institution to confront its own choices. The question hangs unresolved not because it lacks evidence, but because confronting it would mean admitting that men were sent into danger with tools already shadowed by uncertainty. There is no single moment where responsibility is assigned or justice is served, only a gradual shifting of posture as adjustments are made quietly, without acknowledgement of what came before. This absence of resolution is its own answer, suggesting that some failures are easier to absorb than to expose, especially when momentum and reputation are at stake. The crews who live through these encounters carry the knowledge with them, aware that what they survived may never be fully recognized, and that others may face similar risks before the truth is openly addressed. The institution moves forward, as institutions do, absorbing lessons selectively and framing change as progress rather than correction, leaving unanswered whether the cost was considered acceptable at the time it was incurred. The most troubling question is not whether the failure was eventually fixed, but how many lives were placed in jeopardy while certainty was assumed and doubt was deferred. If this could happen once, quietly and repeatedly, then the possibility remains that other failures follow the same path, hidden behind confidence until consequences forced recognition. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and so do organizations determined to maintain belief in their own infallibility. What remains unresolved is whether accountability ever truly catches up to decisions made under pressure, or whether those decisions are simply folded into history as unfortunate necessities. As the story fades without closure, the viewer is left with a question that refuses to settle. When faith in a system overrides evidence of its failure, how many warnings must be ignored before silence itself becomes the most dangerous weapon of all?